Verification. The verification principle came about due to the Vienna Circle, which was a group of philosophers in the 20th century. Their basic principle was that anything unverifiable, so not able to be proven true or false, is meaningless. This makes the only meaningful things maths and science, completely discarding the humanities. To be verifiable, a statement must be proven either analytically or synthetically. Analytically means that a statement can prove itself, whereas synthetically is when you add external evidence from the world to verify it. The Vienna Circle developed this idea into the verification principle, where if you can prove something in the time and place when the claim is made, then it is meaningful, and if not, then it is pointless. This was then considered too restricting by some, as it would also disregard much of maths and science which is theoretical. Therefore, the verification principle became the strong version and a weaker version was developed. AJI and Carnap were the driving force behind a weaker verification, as they argued that it must only be potentially verified rather than actually verified. This can be seen in his example of the statement all canaries are yellow, as it would be absurd to try and count all the canaries, but you know how to theoretically do it. This makes the principle much more applicable. AJI then goes on to write God talk is evidently nonsense. This piece of work can be used throughout essays as it is discarding any talk of a transcendent God. He does this on the basis that due to God's transcendence, this means that he is above this world, therefore evidence from this world cannot be used to back up his existence. This also means we cannot discuss the probability of God, as probability is based on the evidence available. In his second paragraph, Aya talks about how both atheists and theists are equally wrong, as you are not able to prove either way, true or false, in relation to God, as well as agnostics waiting for evidence that will never arrive. Aya also mentions how you could talk of God in an animistic way, but Christians would not accept this, as there is meant to be an epistemic distance between God and us. So he can't be talked of metaphysically, but also not in a more natural way. He does accept the theist idea that God is a mystery within his fifth paragraph, but goes on to say that as he is a mystery to us, then you cannot understand God and can't describe God, leading back to no talk of God. However, he does say that talk of God is more useful in understanding and learning about a person, but ultimately pointless in relation to God. Similarly with ethical statements. Earlier Wittgenstein. Realist. Can religious language have meaning? Picture theory. Wittgenstein influenced the Vienna Circle with his earlier ideas. He said that we have language as it helps us picture what we understand. The idea is that the world limits our language as we cannot speak of what we can't see. This means a priori statements are meaningful but not really useful, as they are tautologies. Wittgenstein also says that, whereof we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence, and as we have no experience of God, we should not talk of him. Flu's theology and falsification. Flu developed this from John Wisdom, and it basically compares our journey in this world to two explorers finding a clearing in a forest. They both see different pieces of evidence to suggest whether there is or isn't a gardener god, such as weeds and flowers. This leads one to be a theist, and the other an atheist. In the end, the theist keeps making excuses for the existence of a gardener, even though they get further away from the original statement each time. This makes the atheist say that there is no difference between a gardener that exists with all the excuses and no gardener at all, similarly to how Christians make excuses for God. The parable of the invisible gardener. Mitchell on Flu. He made the parable of the partisan as a response, which basically says that people have faith in God because they have a connection with him and they feel that they can judge his character. This gives a reason for making excuses for God. Despite this, it could be argued that we don't know God. Flu's response. He raises the problem of evil in response to Mitchell and argues that excuses lead to a death of 1,000 qualifications. Heron flew. He created the parable of the paranoid student. It gave the example of an Oxford University student that loves university but is very convinced that the university professions are trying to kill him. No matter how many nice ones he meets, he might be still convinced. Even though these beliefs aren't true as he hasn't been killed, therefore they are illogical, they still have meaning as they have shaped and affected his life, greatly impacting him for the 3 years of his university education. A quote from Hare's parable is, "But how do I know that this won't happen? The truth is, I don't know." Through this example, Hare introduced the concept of flicks. This is a way of looking at the world, and we each have a different one/perspective. Flu's response. He disagreed with Blix and believed that his idea was fundamentally misguided. He stated that Blick's true or not are your way of looking at the world, and therefore personal and non-cognitive. This means that you cannot tell anyone else that their view is wrong, cannot rank and say it is right or wrong. He states that no one can criticize it, and therefore what is the point? He went on to question whether Hare is really Christian, as if Hare's religion is a Blick involving no cosmological assertions about the nature/activities of a supposed personal creator, then surely he's not a Christian at all. Falsification principle. The falsification principle can be defined as the theory that sentences can only be seen as meaningful if some evidence can count against them. In other words, if you can show them to be false. This principle was initially cited by Popper. He argued that the primary aim, when looking at science, was not verify but to falsify. He gave the example of yellow budgies, stating that it would be impossible to count every yellow budgie to verify it, but rather we can say this to be true unless prove otherwise. For example, if we saw a purple budgie. However, it is important to note that Popper only applied his principle to scientific statements. This then leads us on to Antony Flew, who developed the falsification principle. He applied it more widely and believed that it could be applied to all statements, especially to religious language. Flew stated that for a statement to be meaningful, all we must do is recognize the conditions under which we would reject our beliefs. He highlights this in the example of swans. If I were to believe all swans are white, I would know that I would have to stop believing this if I ever came across a swan of a different color, say a black one. Flew then went on to explain his theory of the unfalsifiable. He noted that sometimes, people can be too committed to their beliefs that they hold on to them, even if there is no evidence to support them or there is evidence to suggest that they're not true. An example of this is someone believing that a celebrity is a good person, despite everyone else pointing out the bad things that the celebrity has done. This would make their belief unfalsifiable because the person is not allowing any evidence to count against their belief. Examples of statements that are unfalsifiable include a committed vegan believing that meat is murder, a pro-life campaigner discussing abortion, a football fan supporting their club. Flew believed that religion was not falsifiable. He stated that if you were to ask a religious believer under what conditions would they agree that God does not exist, they would not be able to provide an answer. He argued that a believer would never say I would no longer believe in God if X happens. Instead, he argued that the believers would likely make excuses to justify their beliefs. This leads nicely onto the next of Flew's arguments, dying the death of 1,000 qualifications. This is the argument that if too many excuses or exceptions are added to a statement, then the original statement becomes meaningless. A simple example of this is Tigger. In this story, Tigger states that he likes everything, but as the story progresses he keeps trying new things and stating that he likes everything except. His original statement therefore becomes meaningless, as more items are added, getting further away from the truth. Flew himself provides the example of a child dying of cancer. The Christian believes that God loves us as a father loves a child, but when the child gets sick with cancer, the earthly father wants to do anything and everything to help. However, there is no visible help from God. Despite the evidence that God doesn't care because he does not act, the believer does not accept that God does not act and instead makes excuses for him, i.e., God's love is different to human love, it is an inscrutable love. Eventually, so many excuses are made that the original statement becomes meaningless. Later Wittgenstein was an anti-realist and explored how can religious language have meaning. He did this by introducing the idea of language games. He believed that the meaning of language was found in how it was used rather than what it was trying to say. He, therefore, argued that only the members of the game could truly understand the language being used. Wittgenstein developed his thinking by introducing the idea of form of life. He argued that words do not carry meanings within themselves. Instead, their meaning is attributed according to the context in which they are used, which is known as the form of life. For example, it would be very difficult to understand the concept of dribbling the ball if we only have a technical definition. Rather, the best way to understand the concept is to actually give it a go. Wittgenstein understood that language was elusive and had many functions. Therefore, it is very complex and cannot be easily reduced to a simple scientific analysis. He went on to provide a clear analogy to show his understanding of language. He compared language to tools in a toolbox, noting that within a toolbox there are numerous tools, each with a different job to do. He argued that the same can be said for language. There are words that are used in different ways for different functions. Wittgenstein stated that we must recognize this when studying language. He believed that when it came to the purpose of language, it is used in many different ways to serve a variety of purposes. For example, language can be used in giving orders, obeying orders, describing the appearance of an object, giving the measurements of an object, constructing an object from a description like a drawing, reporting or speculating about an event, making up a story, asking, thanking, swearing, greeting, praying. Wittgenstein provided several examples for his theory. Another one of these is the rope example. He stated how many different strands come together to form one piece of rope, and the same can be said for language trying to convey meaning. His next example was the ancient city analogy. Wittgenstein stated that our language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses with additions from various periods, and this surrounded by a multitude of new boroughs with straight regular streets and uniform houses. Wittgenstein called his theory language games because there is no single phenomenon called language. Instead, it refers to an indefinite number of different uses, which he called games. He went on to say that despite similarities in language, there is no single essence known as language, but instead his phrase familiar resemblance is all that ties language together. He stated that, for if you look at them you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. Wittgenstein goes on to explain the hierarchy with the language games. After highlighting the different functions, he goes on to explain the different uses. Through the example of chess, he was able to show that there is autonomy with the sphere of the game. There is an agreed understanding of the terms used. For example, castling is meaningful in chess but meaningless in netball. He goes on to highlight how there is an agreed sense of language games rules. The players know what is and is not permitted. These rules are autonomous. Same in language as in games. They are found within the game, not outside of it. Examples of different language games in life are family, friends, college, work. Wittgenstein also clearly highlights how often we don't realize we are in a language game, as it is so natural to us. Wittgenstein did not specifically link his theory to religious languages. He did not address the issue in any great depth or in a systematic manner. Although, there are many aspects of his theory that can be applied to religion. H.G. Wells developed Wittgenstein's ideas on language games by drawing a similar analogy comparing language games to chess. He argued that we cannot come up with a single definition of chess. Therefore, when talking about chess, we tend to use some form of familiar resemblance to show how the many different varieties of chess all relate to each other. Jerry Gill goes on to call the problem of imprecise words and vague meanings that Wittgenstein highlights the principle of sufficient precision. It is clear to see that there are direct contrasts between language games and the verification and falsification principles.